Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Ralph Loura, the Chief Information Officer of Lumentum, a post he's held for roughly 3 years now. Lumentum manufactures optical and photonic products and earns roughly $1.7 billion in annual revenue. Ralph has been a CIO or CTO across companies that include Clorox, HP, and Rodan and Fields prior to his current post. He's an advisor to numerous Silicon Valley startups as well. Lastly, Ralph may well be the best connected chief information officer that I know. He has a remarkable ecosystem, and I look forward to hearing about how he's thought about curating it, among other topics we'll cover together. Ralph, welcome. It's great to speak with you as always.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be with you today, and looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. Well, I gave a brief introduction to Lumentum's business, and as a business-to-business organization, not everyone will be familiar with it who's listening. Can you take just a minute more and provide a bit more insight into Lumentum's business, please?
Sure. We're a global organization, as you said, that manufactures, designs and manufactures technology in the photonics and optical component space. We're global in nature. We have over 20 locations worldwide, R&D centers around the world, manufacturing sites around the world. And we create products largely that are used to help power the modern communication infrastructure and to help map the world around us. So from our 3D sensors to our optical components that make things like this conversation possible today.
That's great. Thank you. And talk a little bit about, the role of IT within your organization. This is not your first company. I mentioned HP, among others. You've worked at Cisco and other tech-centric organizations in the IT organization. So you're quite familiar with finding ways to differentiate and add value as an IT leader in a sea of engineers across the organization. But talk a little bit about some of the areas where IT plays and areas of emphasis on your current strategic roadmap, please.
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is we're a global company. We're, the vast majority of our company are either engineers or in the design and development sense of the term, or in the manufacturing sense of the term. So we have a lot of people that build things, that invent and build things. So it's a kind of unique set of challenges for IT. We enable them, of course, through the traditional tools like video conferencing and productivity tools and so on. But we also spend a very significant amount of our time really embedded with business owners, with the leaders in R&D, with the manufacturing leaders on understanding some of their unique challenges, their opportunities where IT can help solve problems or accelerate value. So we employ a set of methodologies that really originated in the Toyota manufacturing system from the 70s and sort of back in the day. So we use concepts like Kaizen, Hoshin, which are terms that allow us to make sure we're very, very tightly connected to the business. The Hoshin planning process, Hoshin Kanri planning process, allows us to make sure we're in lockstep from a strategic and a sort of goals perspective with everything the business is trying to driving toward. And the Kaizen process is this continuous improvement model that allows us to really kind of wade through some of the difference between desires or demands and, hey, what are we trying to solve for? What's the outcome we're trying to generate? And then we partner together to build outcomes. So what that means is strategic priorities for me are things like really spending a lot of time in the next 2-3 years on improving our factory footprint from a technology perspective. So we have an ongoing initiative to do an uplift of our manufacturing execution system to really provide differentiated capabilities in terms of visualizing what's occurring on the factory floor, being much closer to opportunity from a quality perspective, from a deliverable perspective, and so on. A big initiative around data, like probably everybody else who'd be interested in this podcast. We like many people, generate a huge volume of data. And the real challenge ends up being, how do I unpack that? How do I use that to make better decisions? And increasingly, one of our challenges is, how do I keep it fresh? How do I have my data as fresh as possible? So I'm making real decisions with real data versus sort of decisions based on last week's news. Of course, we've got a number of initiatives around employee productivity, as anyone does in the post-pandemic era, and continuing to improve on how we interact with each other, how we collaborate with each other, and how we stay connected in a distributed world. And then, like everybody, we have a number of initiatives around cyber. ensuring that we're keeping the company protected, employees protected, customers protected in the wave after wave of new challenges and new threats in that world. And then last but not least, worrying about things like tech debt, things like ensuring that our value is aligned to the business. So the cost of IT is aligned to the value that's generated and things like that.
That's a great overview. Thank you for that, Ralph. I would love to peel back the onion on a couple of those. You talked about data and the fact that many companies are drowning in data. It's not a question of having access to data. It's how do you harness it in order to draw better insights from it. And you talked about among the things that you think about is how to keep it fresh and making sure that you are making decisions upon, the up to date data as opposed to making decisions on out of date data. Talk about some of the other sort of guiding principles you think about and that you apply in developing a data strategy.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, in an earlier life, in my role as CIO for Hewlett Packard Enterprise, we did some mapping, and at the time, we kind of shockingly discovered that over 70% of the processing time in our big data landscape was spent moving data around, and only 30% was actually, getting value from the data. Most of the time was making copies of it and processing it and moving it through the environment. And I think that's probably true of a lot of people. It's certainly true. We haven't done the analysis, but I think it's probably true at Lumentum as well. We spend a lot of time ingesting data, creating relationships among data, and then moving data through various systems and processing engines. To the degree I can stop doing that. So using concepts like we've all heard of a data warehouse, we've all heard of a data lake. Well, if you put the two together, there's a concept people are talking about these days about a lake house, sort of part data lake and part data warehouse. And it's just got these days has a charming ring to it, right? We'd all like to spend time in a lake house. But the idea is some of data warehouses are really good at storing structured data, if you will. Data lakes are really good at storing unstructured data. And the idea is, hey, how do I get both? How do I create the value of a data lake, and then I can access data quickly in an ad hoc manner without a whole lot of pre-thought processing. But marry that with some of the long-term value and the long-term storage of a data warehouse. And there's a number of technology startups that have been doing work in that space, and we're working with a couple of them, and it's having pretty good payoff in that we're getting data that's more current, we're handling it less, and it seems to be somewhat future-proof in that later, when I have a different use for it than I have today, I haven't kind of transformed the data in a way that lost some of the fidelity of a system.
No, that's a great overview as well. Interesting in how you think about that and how you strive to get more value out of the data you're using as opposed to simply processing it, which is a really important point given the vast quantities of data that so many organizations have. I want to also talk about cybersecurity. You raised that as an area that is of great importance, as it should be, of course, in any IT organization. And in many ways, it's unfortunately a topic that continues to gain momentum and has significant complexity that CIOs and CISOs and other executives need to make sure they're mindful of, even as they're taking risks associated with innovating. Talk a bit about your own orientation relative to that, as the threats unfortunately are not becoming any less complex, and yet still having this need to continue to take calculated risks while also being mindful of the consequences of that. How do you think about that?
Well, I think my own personal experience, perspective, and I think most of the industries has evolved over my career. Certainly, originally we thought of cybersecurity in a defensive way. I'm going to build a strong wall and a moat, and I'm going to kind of gate people before they come into the company with VPN access and other things, and I'm going to keep the bad guys out, right? And that was kind of the real goal was, hey, let's never get breached. And I think we would all love a very strong external defense, and we all strive to not have malicious actors in our environment. But the reality is we have a fairly permeable defense in most modern enterprises. We have email, which is a notoriously We've got a plethora of mobile apps that people are using, APIs in the cloud and on-prem, passing data and interacting, files being kind of moved around through multiple platforms and devices, some of which IT manages, some of which we don't. So we live in a kind of porous membrane kind of world in a way that you just can't change. It'd be nice to kind of go back and put the lid back on the box, but that's not doable. So in that world, what do I do? Like, how do I think about things differently? So now you have to think about it in terms of how quickly can I react? How quickly can I detect if someone is past that membrane? How do I make sure that if it's a minor breach, I'm responding appropriately, and if it's a major breach, I'm responding appropriately. How do I contain? We talk a bit about containing the blast radius. Right? So if someone does gain access inappropriately to a set of data, how do I make sure it's the smallest set of data possible? How do I make sure it's the fewest number of systems impacted, so I can isolate that damaged portion and then move on. And then, how do I take the largest, one of the biggest risks these days is the risk of ransomware. So how do I, in the event that I were a breach, in the event that all my other safeguards and fail safes and all my other preparation had failed, how do I ensure that I don't end up, kind of dead in the water or having some major, operational or financial impact? So things like encrypting a lot of things, creating snapshots, a lot of things, backing a lot of things up in the cloud or in other places versus in a contiguous on-prem environment, and then a lot of data isolation and segregation, so that again, if something does get breached or something does happen, that's not affecting the entirety of the enterprise. It's affecting small parts that I can then isolate and address.
Yeah, that's interesting. You also mentioned you began your overview of the strategic areas of focus for your organization and spending time on improving how the factory footprint and managing the factory footprint from a technology perspective. Talk a little bit more about what that entails, please, Ralph.
Yeah. So we have a number of wafer fabs. So we make silicon chips. One of the challenges of the process from where you start with an epi wafer until you actually end up with a fully diced chip ready to go in a customer, maybe weeks, and maybe 9, 10, 12 weeks. Well, boy, I'd really like to know what's happening, in step 1 or step 2 versus waiting until step 200 to find out, what my yield is going to be, what my cost looks like, what the performance of those chips looks like in terms of power consumption or output and other things. So we have a number of things today that'll give us telemetry, that give us information coming out of that manufacturing process. Our MES systems don't always keep up. So we may not understand until step 12 of a process. We may have a place where we're measuring something, where an operator is interacting with something, and then we get information. Or it may be step 23 or whatnot. What I love is almost every step of a recipe to have feedback as to what's working, what's not. So I can measure, I can compare to other runs we've done to look at anomalies and get better intel, and so on. And so much of our approach around MES, or manufacturing execution system replacement, is refreshing that world to one that's essentially measuring everything. People talk about the Internet of Things or the factory of the future, or Factory 4.0. There's a number of terms in the industry, but our approach is, again, looking at outcomes, not necessarily following a model. Okay, how do I get better information in the hands of the factory manager, the R&D leader, and the sales team, so we know where we are in the process and we can take action earlier to ensure better quality, better efficiencies, better outcomes.
Ralph, for some time now, you've been in the market for hiring great people across multiple organizations. You've seen the war for talent in a variety of different geographies and in a variety of different settings. And there are some special case examples emerging now as well. But I'd love for you to sort of just assess, if you would, what some of the changing dynamics exist as you think about talent these days.
It's interesting. Lots of people have talked in the past about the war for talent, and particularly being in a tech-centric geography where lots of people are competing for data scientists or coders or whatnot. It's been a topic for some time. I think what's a bit different these days is, again, post-pandemic, the power has shifted in large part from the employer to determine and define the terms of employment, and the employee gets to choose if they accept that or not and which company to go to. And now in many cases, existing employees or prospective employees are demanding or defining new terms that they'd like to work under. Fully remote being one of them, or hybrid, or hey, I want you to invest in my education, or I want different opportunities. And so it's become an interesting pivot, I would say, of power from the employer to the employee in this space. And we're all working in remote environments as we experience. So we have the flexibility to work somewhere else without having to disrupt our family and our friends and our social networks and so on. So one, I think the power has shifted, and the employees are setting specific examples of what they're doing now. The second thing that's occurring is the war for talent was geography based. Since it's no longer geography based, people have begun to focus a bit differently on what they want out of a job and want out of a role. It used to be we would do performance reviews and say, okay, where do you see yourself in 3 years? And people would sit there and go, I don't know, like making more money and being promoted or whatever. Now, when you say, where do you see yourself in 3 years? People have very specific answers. I want to be here. I want to be here with my family. I want to be doing this in my career. I want to have the opportunity to do that, which I think is wonderful. People have started to be a bit introspective about what they want out of life and out of their job. But it's requiring employers and leaders to think really differently about the relationship they have with their employees and how they lead.
Tell me, how do you, Ralph, how do you get past? So part of what you're saying is certainly the way in which they're thinking about their interactions with their bosses is different from the way you thought about your interactions with your bosses when you were a 20-something or a 30-something, for example. And how do you overcome the sort of thought process of, this is not how it was in my day, and the potential interpretation of that of being entitlement in some way? How have you processed that and recognizing the differences between this generation and your generation? Back when you were sort of rising in your career.
I do hear it occasionally in circles discussing talent, this sense of entitlement coming up. Kind of the whole, back in our day, we walked uphill barefoot in the snow, both ways to work. They have it easy, kind of thing. And I guess my personal answer to that is, you have to think. I mean, people are people, and you have to get to know the person, the human being first. And you have to focus on the person. And there's got to be a fit for that person and the work you're doing and so on. And so if you think of people as sort of interchangeable tools to achieve an outcome, then I think that like you've already lost. But if you're thinking people in terms of people, what are their motivations? Where do they want to be? What inspires them? Then I think you're on the right track, and this will all unfold appropriately. So I remember a mentor and an old friend, a dear friend, Tom Mendoza at NetApp, used to talk about, and they had 5 sort of cultural elements they talked about. And one of them was this idea of kind of having people passionate about what they do and an optimistic attitude and some other things. Somebody once asked him, hey, what do you do with like a non-motivated person at NetApp? And he goes, well, I don't know what you do, but what I try to do is find them and fire them. And people were a bit shocked with the answer. And he said, no. He goes, what I'm saying is, my job is to provide a compelling place to work, exciting environment, interesting, opportunity, the tools to succeed. It's your job to show up excited every day to go do that. And if you're not excited about doing what we're doing, what we've collectively elected to do, then I can't fix that. Like my job then is to get you out of the environment as fast as I can, so that I can bring somebody else in that's just as excited as I am to go do the work we're doing. And so in a way, it's how do I make sure I create an exciting, compelling, rewarding environment, provide the tools to be successful, and then go find the people that care about what I've built or am building and want to be part of the journey.
That's a great answer, certainly. I mentioned in the introduction, Ralph, that you've worked in a number of different big companies across a variety of different industries as well. And I'm sure it's given you reason to contemplate the commonalities and differences company to company in terms of their use in harnessing digital as a set of concepts and ideas impact the operation, the employee experience, the customer experience, the products and services the companies develop, and the like. I wonder, it's a broad topic, admittedly, but I wonder if there may be some high level conclusions you might point to as you contemplate some of those commonalities and differences.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune to have a pretty broad set of experiences. Early in my career, I was at high tech companies in the telecom world and then the data networking world. And then I made a pivot and spent some time in life sciences. So worked for a small pharmaceutical company. I got a very different appreciation of what digital means in that world, which is a lot about compliance and quality and data, adverse event reporting, and a lot of gathering of data and then analysis of data. Whereas earlier in the tech and manufacturing world, what data was important. A huge part of the focus of digital, if you will, in a B2B sales, a B2B tech sales environment is about understanding the buyer's choices and getting telemetry on demand and demand planning and fulfillment and things versus internal processes. So I get to live this sort of one set of data, digital world, and a very different kind of focus of digital. And from there, I went to Clorox, a large 100-year-old consumer brands company where historically, the first 100 years of existence, they lived in a decidedly analog world, selling through retail channels, having people physically interact with their product by picking up on a shelf and looking at the bottle and kind of turning it around and so on. And then they had to pivot in the kind of late 2008, 9, 10 timeframe to a world that became largely digital. A lot more people are buying those products through digital channels like Amazon or Walmart.com or others. And so for them, it was very much, how do I create a sort of digital twin of my product, and how do I help a consumer interact with that and get a sense of my brand and my product in a different channel or a different way, while of course doing internal things to support that work. HP, kind of back to the tech world, Rodan Field's an e-commerce company really built on a social platform about sharing stories and connecting people to people. So it was really taking an analog world of relationships and multiplying it with a lot of digital assets to try to help, kind of create the glue and the excitement through that. And we did some really innovative things like create a video platform from scratch to drive engagement, a captive video platform to drive engagement in education and other things. So anyway, a long way to say, I think that at the core, some of the internal focus are very similar, right? A lot of how do I help digitize the inside of a company? That's pretty straightforward, and I think common. A lot of companies focus on the employee experience, looking at end-to-end processes, employee onboarding, employee offboarding. Those sort of things can be, employee expense management. Digitizing those things are pretty common across any industry or any company. But really, I think being thoughtful about what is it our company does, how do we do it, what are value drivers or multipliers, and how can I kind of find a little niche to put a pry bar of technology into to really help open up some of those value streams a bit differently.
That's a great overview. I also mentioned at the outset that one of the things I've always admired about you, Ralph, is this remarkable ecosystem that you have. You are very well connected. You're somebody who comes up often when I'm in discussions with a whole range of people in the broader tech landscape. You must know Ralph Loura, and I'm pleased I can say yes, of course. And I wonder how you've thought about that. How have you gone about curating the ecosystem that you have, and maybe speak a little bit about the benefits you garner from being very intentional in your methods there?
Yeah. So also very specifically, there was a particular point in time when I decided, hey, I should have a better network. And at the time, networking had a kind of pejorative term. It was sort of this like benefiting kind of exercise to go kind of find people to help you with something. And so I'd never looked at networking as a positive. It was sort of like a kind of used car salesman sort of behavior of like false engagement. But the point in time was it was 2006. I was CIO at Symbol Technologies, and after a very long internal transition and growth, we sold the company to Motorola. And as part of that, I found myself after a heads down, 80-hour week kind of role, really internally focused, popping my head up and going, oh, it's time to go find another role. And I realized, gee, I hadn't talked to anybody in probably 3 years. The 3 years we'd been doing this internal transition and turnaround. And so nobody knew what I had done and where I was and what was going on. And I had to spend several months sort of networking and catching up and connecting with people from a position where I did need something. I'm looking for another opportunity. And I realized then, I said, most of those conversations turned into, wow, had I only known you back when I was in the middle of this transition, like that, it would have been so much more helpful, or I could have been helpful to you. We just lived through the same experience. We could have saved each other a lot of time and torment. And so I made it kind of a pact with myself that I would, no matter how busy I was, no matter how internally focused I was, that I would always spend time connecting with my peers, sharing what we were doing, understanding what they were doing, and trying to help. And so when I was in Long Island with Symbol, I started a CIO networking group where we met all the CIOs on the island that I could kind of put together. We met once a month for dinner and kind of shared stories. Later, when I moved to the Phoenix market and worked at a pharmaceutical company called Medicis, I created one of the first CIO groups in the Phoenix area where we got together for breakfast and would socialize and share the same sort of things. And then back in the Bay Area with Clorox, I was actually chair of the San Francisco-based group, CIO group, for a number of years. There are 3 different long-running groups. I connected with one of those groups. I chaired the one in the city. I was very active in the South Bay and East Bay groups, and then with members of a few others. And I just found connecting with peers, spending time with peers, really valuable. The role of the CIO is both you get a lot of attention and visibility because of the nature of what you're doing in the company, but it's a bit of a lonely job in that. In fact, I had a conversation with one CEO of mine in my career where he said, "Hey, we've been talking to about succession planning, and we've been talking to the board, and the board's really concerned about your role not having a successor." And I said, "Well, none of the other roles in the company truly do. We're all fairly thinly staffed." And his comment was, "Yeah, but we have 4 BU leaders. Like, if one of them left, one of the other BU leaders could take over a BU. Like, we have a head of strategy could probably take over from the CFO or vice versa if one of them left. Like, nobody else in the company knows how to do your job," which I realized was fairly true. And so it's a lonely job in a way. And so to get perspective, to share ideas, to get validation, or frankly, a lot of times to get someone who'll tell you, "Hey, it doesn't sound like that's working for you." Like, to have that kind of conversation, requires kind of going outside and building relationships of people you trust, where you can have that kind of candid feedback and candid relationship.
You also have a part of your ecosystem and facilitated, no doubt, by being in the milieu for more than a decade now of Silicon Valley, of the startup communities, venture-backed organizations. You serve on the advisory boards of numerous companies in that space as well. And it gives you kind of a beat on trends. You're somebody who's always thinking about the art of the possible and its application back into the company you're a part of, in this case, Lumentum, of course. Talk a bit about some of what your latest thinking is relative to trends and things you're getting excited about as you continue to mine the relationships in Silicon Valley and the startup community, and just working with your team on what the future might hold for your organization.
It's interesting. So as part of that networking, I guess I've also really sought out venture capital companies. So I've been a CIO, advisor to a number of VC firms, as well as getting involved in a more granular level, advising startups, specific startups, because I find the passion there, some of the thinking there, and then getting grounded in the reality of what they're trying to accomplish, really kind of rewarding. And I do strike a balance between. I've also been on the executive councils of large platform companies that are mature tech companies, like over time NetApp and SAP and Oracle and others, where I've been involved in a larger company from a customer advisor kind of perspective. So I think as I look at the technology landscape today, people have been talking about things like AI and ML for a while, machine learning and artificial intelligence. And they used to talk about in terms of, what are you doing with AI and ML, and is that changing this or affecting that, as an end unto itself. And I think people are realizing to talk about AI and ML is like talking about, are you using servers in your environment? It's a tool, and it's becoming a ubiquitous tool in almost every aspect of what we're doing. So I think the interesting startups or interesting technology plays in that space, AI and ML, are people that have a very specific point of view and a problem domain that they really understand, and have found, okay, now I've got the domain knowledge that's necessary. I've got a point of view about how this domain is not functioning efficiently. And now I've got this unique new tool that, instead of going and hiring a bunch of people and coding a bunch of things and trying to chip away at the rock face for years, I can deploy these really interesting new tools that allow me to scale more quickly, make more progress, and become more interesting as a scale platform much more quickly. And so I've recently met with CEOs of a couple of AI and ML powered companies that are focusing on different problem domains, where I think their time to market is probably halved, if not a third of what it would have been had they not had those tools to apply. I think the spaces people are going after today are kind of different. It used to be, hey, you wanted to become a national or a global player. You wanted to build a platform. The big mantra of the last decade or two of tech investment was, hey, are you going to be a new platform, or are you just an application? And I think more and more people are realizing there are spaces to play in verticals that are really unserved, because have this horizontal platform focus. So some of the vertical areas I think that are unserved are things like the manufacturing floor. The factory floor, there are precious few systems at scale that really have attacked that environment. And there are a couple of interesting players there that are looking at that differently and bringing in industry people with lots of experience to go tackle that problem. I know a number of good friends of mine who are in the restaurant and hospitality business as CIOs. And boy, what an interesting year and a half for them. So they're applying new technologies to solve really specific problems in the food service space or the restaurant retail space. It's really, I think, potentially be game changing. So I at least don't see a lot of the next Salesforce or the next Workday or something in the horizon. What I see is some really interesting players solving specific problems in vertical industries and in specific spaces. They may evolve into something bigger, but their core focus is in that space. So to summarize, I think ML/AI is really interesting. I think sensor networks are interesting. So this, as I said, the data coming off of things and then processing, doing something with that. There are a ton of new approaches in the cyberspace, just like there are a ton of new threats in the cyberspace. That seems to be a dance we'll be doing for quite some time. So staying abreast of a lot of the new changes there and a lot of what people are bringing to the table is really interesting. And then if I had to make a non-technology or non-enterprise kind of bet, I'm a big believer in the autonomous revolution that's occurring. I think autonomous driving is a piece of it, but there's a lot of increasing. We're seeing the true reality of household robots and household appliances and things that have become made more autonomous based on technology being mature, at scale, and affordable to apply in a number of those spaces. And that will be really interesting over the next 5 years or so.
That's very interesting. I also want to just quickly probe as I think across the various parts of your strategy. There are a number of areas there, and you've even begun to incorporate in how you've used the thinking or solutions of startups to help enrich some of your thought process around those strategies, around the use of data, around cyber. I would presume also around the elimination of technical debt, perhaps in establishing new standards as well. To what extent, when you are developing your own technology or digital strategy, are you leavening what you are learning in the VC community to educate yourself as to how quickly and in what direction you might move relative to some of these topics?
Yeah, so one of our board members and I, we had a board meeting this morning, and in the video conference window, he private messaged me, and I was talking about data visualization, a particular tool we're using, and he said, "Hey, now that a large player had acquired them, you should look. What's your next move in case something happens and that becomes untenable. And so I said, no, we're watching this all the time. So we're looking at the evolution of that space, data visualization, data processing, the consumerization of data kind of stuff, democratization of data. Who are the big players? Who are the, maybe not the big players, but the players with a really interesting twist? And then some of this is, it's akin to farming. Like you're out there, you've planted a bunch of crops and you're kind of waiting to see what comes ripe at the right time. So it's sort of the farm to table movement from a technology perspective. Hey, what's ripe this week that we're going to apply to solve the problems we have this week? So we stay really well connected, I think, to the startup ecosystem, both for ideas, but also to see, hey, when is it time to make a move or make a change? Because these things have large switching costs. I've got retraining to do. I've got a bunch of things to do if I'm going to bring in a new technology at scale. So understanding when you think it's time, and then not only when do you think it's time, but predicting that, because I have to go to the board and my executive committee and say, hey, 3 years from now, I'm going to have a large capital expense, and let's start planning for that. We're going to have a transition cost and some other things. So trying to forecast when, and how that happens is something we spend a decent amount of time on.
That's great. Well, Ralph, Loura, thank you so much for joining me on Technovation today. There are a few people that have as much breadth of experience as a chief information or technology officer as you have. And it's wonderful, as always, to learn from you the lessons from across that breadth of experiences, as well as projecting forward what you see the future potentially holding, generally speaking, for Lumentum more specifically. As always, it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Always great catching up with you.